Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. This should be a great late night conversation. We're always happy to speak with all of you here. Um, I am excited. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Yeah, I am here to engage with you all, answer your questions. It's going to be fun. So let's do it.
American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. Should be a great conversation here tonight. Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the way that we do things, first I give my opening remarks, which is what I'm doing right now. Then from there, we do a roll call where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. We find out who is on the other side of the camera, who is watching. And it's always a great crowd of people from a lot of different places, a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different locations and parts of the world, parts of the United States. It's always great to find out who is watching. A good mix of men and women, people of different nationalities and ethnic groups and backgrounds. It's really, really amazing, everyone who watches. Then after that, I answer your questions for the rest of the night. I answer people's Rumble questions. Rumble rants come in, and I answer Rumble rant questions. I answer super chat questions from YouTube. I answer Rockfin tips. So if you have something you would like me to speak about in the second half of our show, the time has come that you should be sending me a super chat. Send me a super chat, a Rumble rant, a Rockfin tip. Your questions make the second half of the show happen. And as I've always said on these streams, I have always said that those of you who watch this live, you have a unique power, because unlike the people who watch this tomorrow, the next day, or years from now, you have the ability to direct the conversation however you want it to go. With your ability to send in a super chat, you can make the conversation go however you want. And that is quite a privilege. This is an interactive conversation that we do here. This is not just me talking at my camera. If I did that, I would record and upload it afterwards. This is here for me to engage with you. That is the purpose of these streams, for me to engage with you, answer your questions, respond to what is on your mind. So I strongly urge you to use that power. Use that power. Send a question, send something for me to react to, give me something to react to respond to. That is what I urge you to do. So if you could go ahead and do that and make the second half of the show fruitful, that would be awesome. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and I am now going to begin my opening remarks. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Happy Saturday night. Folks, I'll drink some unnamed water beverage. Folks, you all know that I've written a number of books. But in addition to the books that I personally have written, there are a number of books that we recommend on these streams. Books that are not published by the Center for Political Innovation, books that are not authored by our own members, but books that we strongly recommend that people read if they want to grasp what is happening in the world today. And I can quickly talk about what some of those books are. And these are the books that have helped me to understand where we're at. These are books that have spoken to me with a great deal of clarity and helped me come to understand the big questions of our time. These are the books that we generally recommend beyond our own publications that people read. The book that I always tell people is the most educational book. And at one point, I called it the best book I've ever read. I don't know if I would still say that, but it's up there. Is this book, The History of the Three Internationals, The World Socialist and Communist Movements from 1848 to Present by William Z. Foster. This book is the most complete, the most readable, comprehensible explanation of the Marxist ideology and history of the Marxist movement from the time of the Communist Manifesto right up until the 1950s, before the death of Stalin. This book will teach you about everything you need to know. William Z. Foster, he was the leader of the Communist Party during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Before he died, he wrote a number of history books. He wrote The History of the Three Internationals. He also wrote The History of the Communist Party of the United States. He wrote The History of the Negro People in America. He wrote The History of the World Trade Union Movement. And he also wrote a book called The Outline Political History of the Americas, which I believe was the inspiration for Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, because Howard Zinn was only briefly a member of the Communist Party, but he was a member when William Z. Foster was running it, when these books were being published. And The History of the Three Internationals. All right, this will tell you basically everything you need to know about the global communist movement. This is really such an important book because it gives you a history of the ideology of the Marxist movement. It gives you a history of the fights that have gone on among Marxists. And I tell people that it was really when I was studying this book, it was when I was studying the history of the Three Internationals in the year of 2009, 2010, that I really started to become a Marxist. I might have called myself a Marxist before that, but I always thought almost in religious terms. I thought the world has problems, and the answer is communism. I thought of communism as some kind of magical elixir, some kind of magical solution, that if the world has problems, what we do is we go and we give them some communism, and some communism will fix the problems. Well, that's not a scientific way of understanding these things. Marxism views the world as driven forward by contradiction, by struggle, by different contending social forces. And what I remember striking me so hard when I first read this book, The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, was Karl Marx's support for Abraham Lincoln, and reading and studying about how much Karl Marx did to support Abraham Lincoln, how much the Marxist movement did to back Abraham Lincoln, and the vital role that Marxists played in the struggle to defeat slavery in the United States, and how it was by inserting themselves into that real contradiction that they were able to advance themselves in history. I also particularly enjoyed the debates and the polemics and the divisions between Marx and the anarchists that are also well documented in this text. So I really do recommend The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. I want to go over some of the other books that are part of our pedagogy, I guess you could say, part of our worldview. They're like bricks little bricks that all add up to the Center for Political Innovation worldview. One book that I've been referring to a lot lately, not a very long book, you know, I mean, how many pages is it? It's only, right? It's only 150 pages, 149 pages. The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary. This book, published by Nelson Peary, a longtime communist. It's transcribed lectures that he gave. Copyright 2001, 2002. And it is, you know, it is great. And you will get an understanding of Marxist economics. This is transcribed lectures that he gave to his followers, explaining Marxist economics, explaining the role of technology, talking about the robots and their role in making capitalism unsustainable. This book, I really do recommend. And it's one of the books, one of the 3 books that I recommend that addresses the issue of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, which is an essential part of the CPI worldview. This understanding that technology and technological advancement is a good thing, but in our capitalist system, it leads to greater unemployment. Abundance creates poverty in a highly irrational system. And that point is made in this book, The Future is Up to Us. And the other 2 books that make this point very eloquently that I recommend to people are, and this was the book that had a lot to do with my early political education in the aftermath of the financial crisis, Low-Wage Capitalism: What the New Globalized High-Tech Imperialism Means for the Class Struggle in the U.S. by Fred Goldstein. Low-Wage Capitalism, Colossus with Feet of Clay. And then this book that was published in the 1980s, High-Tech, Low Pay, a Marxist Analysis of the Changing Character of the Working Class by Sam Marcy. It's unfortunate that you know, some of these books are harder to find than others. Now, the Nelson Peary book, The Future is Up to Us, you can get that online. The Future is Up to Us. You can get a PDF of it. You know, you can get a PDF of that pretty easily. Marxist Internet Archive. I'll drop it in the chat. You know, Low-Wage Capitalism, I believe, you can get a PDF of it now. And the Sam Marcy book, you can get a PDF of it. But some of these books are harder to find than others. But a lot of the Marxist Internet Archive, I'm always impressed with the Marxist Internet Archive, how they're able to kind of, you know, get a collection of obscure texts. Shout out to Lee Stranahan, by the way, a longtime radio host, an anti-war activist, an advocate of civil liberties. Shout out to you, Lee. I'm glad you're joining us. And shout out to David Fox. And shout out to Terry and everybody in the chat right now. We've got a good crew of people here. We're all set and ready for a late night conversation, ready to engage with each other. But I'm just kind of going over different books that we ourselves at the Center for Political Innovation did not publish, but books that are kind of essential in understanding our worldview. That if you want to understand the way the city building tendency, the CPI, the way we see things, you want to understand the intellectual trajectory and the intellectual foundations of our worldview, these are books I would recommend. Another book that I would recommend, that Peter Coffin, I introduced Peter Coffin to this book, and he just fell in love with it. And I worked really hard to make sure people have copies of this book. And this book is really, really important. This book is called Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. And it's not a new book. This book was published in 1934. Very old book. But during the Great Depression, when Hitler and fascist movements were on the rise, R. Palm Dutt, who was a leader, he was the main theoretician of the British Communist Party, he wrote a Marxist analysis of why the Great Depression was happening and the economic foundations of fascism and why fascism is degrowth economics. Fascism is the idea that economic growth is bad, that you need a heavy-handed state to drive down consumption, to reduce living standards and reduce consumption. And this book, Fascism and Social Revolution, is really, really essential into understanding the economics of fascism. And I do recommend this book that people read. There's a few other books that are part of the CPI pedagogy, I guess, and they're from diverse sources. There's one book which I don't. Do we have it? Is it on the shelf over here? I have it somewhere, and it's a book. It's called "The Yankee and Cowboy War" by Carl Oglesby, and I reference that book quite a bit. And what's interesting is that book is loved by many libertarians. Murray Rothbard apparently really liked that book. And there were a number of libertarians who really liked the book, The Yankee and Cowboy War, because it was something that many libertarians and people within the ruling class are very aware of, that among the American elite, there is a battle between the ultra-rich and the rich, the entrenched old money New England monopolies who dominate American capitalism, and the rest of the millionaires and billionaires who aren't part of the club, who just want to make money and are not down with their whole social engineering agenda. And many libertarians and right-wingers have been aware of that divide for a long time. Carl Oglesby, who was a 1960s radical, he wrote a very popular understanding of that that included an analysis of the Kennedy assassination. It's kind of a JFK conspiracy book. As well as an analysis of the Watergate scandal and how Nixon was driven from office. And it's called The Yankee and Cowboy War. But he was not the first person to come up with that analysis, that division within the ruling class, the idea that factions in the ruling class are battling, and it's the old money, the New England Eastern establishment against the rest of the ruling class. And one of the main people to put that theory forward was a guy named Carroll Quigley. And Carroll Quigley was a mentor to Bill Clinton. Carroll Quigley was a political scientist and a historian, an academic, and he wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment, and he wrote a huge book, well over 1,000 pages, making the same argument, called Tragedy and Hope, which is supposed to be a history of Western civilization. And in Tragedy and Hope and in the Anglo-American establishment, he makes this argument that there's this Eastern establishment, this entrenched New England old money that is kind of battling against the lower levels of capital. And then, of course, one of the people who very much had that understanding, and that was essential to his worldview, was Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche, who was a Marxist for a long time, was known as Lynn Marcus and was a Trotskyite Marxist. And then later in the 1970s, he drifted away from Marxism and developed his own worldview. Lyndon LaRouche, he very much developed that understanding as well. And so this is an essential part of what we believe, right? If you read my book, Where is America Going? Where is America going? The first chapter, what you're hearing in that first chapter, you're hearing R. Palm Dutt, you're hearing Fred Goldstein, you're hearing Sam Marcy, you're hearing Nelson Peary, you're hearing the understanding of technology creating an economic crisis, etc. And if you read the second, third, and fourth chapters, you're reading Carroll Quigley. You're reading LaRouche. You're reading The Yankee and Cowboy War, Carl Oglesby, and that understanding is very essential to what we are doing here as well. The idea that there's a division in the ruling class between the Eastern New England establishment that is very much oligarchical and has a social engineering agenda. They want a tightly controlled capitalism in order to maintain their power. They're more interested in long-term stability than they are in short-term profits. That division within the ruling class between the managerial bourgeoisie, the oligarchical social engineers of the Eastern establishment, the round table group of Lord Milner and Cecil Rhodes, versus the lower-level capitalists of the military-industrial complex and the local money makers, that division in the ruling class, that is essential to understanding what's going on. If you want to understand January 6th, if you want to understand why Donald Trump is being hit with all kinds of criminal charges right now, If you want to understand these things, you must understand that fight within the ruling class. And so that's a book that's a really big part of CPI worldview and CPI ideology. But we talk about other things on these streams, right? When we talk about divisions in the ruling class, we talk about the problem of overproduction. Another book that I've often been referring to, and I've referenced many, many times, is The New York Intellectuals. And this is a history of, it's called the New York Intellectuals, the rise and decline of the anti-Stalinist left from the 1930s to the 1980s. And this book is important because we're talking about neoconservatism, and we're talking about synthetic leftism, anti-communist leftism that was supported by the CIA and by the American government. And this book goes into great detail documenting that phenomenon, where all these people that are listed on the cover came from. Irving Howe, Sidney Hook, Hannah Arendt, Edmund Wilson, Mary McCarthy, Irving Kristol, Philip Roth, Dwight MacDonald. There's a whole milieu of people who went on to become very prominent leaders of the American political establishment on the left and the right, who originated as Trotskyites, as anti-communist socialists, who turned against Stalin. They were supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution. They'd been inspired by Trotsky, and they turned against Stalin, and they went all over the place. And what's weird is that American political history, and you're on the list, and keep the super chats rolling in, folks. Give me something to talk about in the second half of our show. American political history does not give enough attention to these people, because really the anti-Stalinist left and their worldview has basically come to define American politics. And I streamed about that a few days ago. But their middle-class individualism and middle-class radicalism and their pessimism has defined American politics really since the 1960s, at least. The right is dominated by the neocons, the neoconservatives, and the neoconservatives are of this mindset. They are from the tradition of Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss. And the left is dominated by this mindset as well. The left, you've got Hannah Arendt, you've got Susan Sontag, and that kind of thinking, right? What we call postmodernism or anti-populism, this kind of anti-totalitarian leftism that views the masses with contempt. That also defines the left, and that's very much, from the so-called anti-Stalinist left of the New York Intellectuals as well. And that is an essential part of our worldview, especially as we talk about philosophical irrationalism. And what I have come to argue, and shout out to Bill Preston, for his work and his efforts to help me to understand this as our worldview here has developed, is that largely what these people were expressing, what the New York Intellectuals, who have come to dominate American political discourse and American political thought, what they were expressing was really an incarnation of a much wider philosophical trend, and that's called philosophical irrationalism, which George Lukács critiques in his book, The Destruction of Reason. And it's really the worldview of Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher. He was originally a Nazi, and then he felt the Nazis had abandoned their principles. He was, an anti-revisionist Nazi. And Martin Heidegger, who had been very essential in helping establish the Nazi movement, and then broke with the Nazis because he felt they weren't Nazi enough. Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, along with Friedrich Nietzsche, they have a worldview that is defined by George Lukács in this book as the destruction of reason and philosophical irrationalism. It is the belief that there is no real truth, that the universe is defined by chaos rather than by order, and that because the universe is defined by chaos, any attempt to give an ordered definition to the universe. Any attempt to say there's a beginning and that there's an end, any attempt to say that there's right and that there is wrong, any attempt to build up people's loyalty, any attempt to urge people to make sacrifices for something they believe in, anything of that effect, it's argued, is somehow a totalitarian threat. And it worships, there's the cult of the individual. Nietzsche talked excessively about the ancient Greek hero who defines his own morality, lives for his own pleasure, you know, you know, and he talks about hedonism and who forces the universe to work in his interest, you know, forces himself onto the world. That is the ideal person. And in his work Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche speaks with contempt of Christianity. He sees it as slave morality, right? Christianity is slave morality because it says that it's good to be humble and it's good to be meek and it's good to care for others. And that if you suffer in this life, you will get justice, and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And Nietzsche loathes that mindset, right? He loathes it, and he equates it with communism. Friedrich Nietzsche said that communism was nothing but Christianity. I agree with him. I just think that's a good thing. But Nietzsche has utter contempt for Christian values. He's looking back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the survival of the fittest, and he's hailing the rise of colonialism and imperialism because he's saying it gives birth to what he calls the blonde beast, and that we're returning to our primitive, barbaric way of being. We're getting back to the ancient Roman and ancient Greek way of being. We're shedding the slave morality of medieval Europe. I mean, that's Friedrich Nietzsche, and that stuff is particularly vile. But that is really what the New York intellectuals, both the neocons and the synthetic left, that's essentially what they believe. They view the masses with contempt. They view compassion and kindness as being for suckers, as being for people that are easily manipulated. They view selfishness and individualism as the highest good. They are postmodernists in that they believe that any philosophy is a totalitarian attempt at totalism, and that they can assert their will onto the universe. That is what they believe, and that's postmodernism, and that's philosophical irrationalism. And much of what we do on these streams is centered around opposition to philosophical irrationalism, opposition to postmodernism. And that's why we get very annoyed when people like Jordan Peterson start going around and saying, oh, it's the postmodern neo-Marxists that are the problem. You can't be a Marxist and a postmodernist. Postmodernism was anti-communist and always has been anti-communist. Communism is a grand narrative of humanity. Communism is an ideology. Communism says there is a beginning, hunter-gatherer civilization, and then from there, we had the origin of private property and slavery, and then feudalism, and then the rise of the proletariat under capitalism. It eventually says we can get to socialism, and then we can get to communism. It has an end, it has a beginning and an end. It has certain laws of history with dialectical and historical materialism. It says that there is objective reality. It says that the mind is only a reflection of material reality. Thought is inseparable from matter that thinks. Marxism is completely contrary to postmodernism. Postmodernism says that there is no objective truth. Postmodernism says there is no grand narrative. And postmodernism only celebrates deconstruction. Well, Marxism only deconstructs in order to make way for itself. Marxism doesn't deconstruct for deconstruction's sake. Marxism, it deconstructs capitalism. It deconstructs Christianity. It deconstructs idealism. It deconstructs different worldviews because it says Marxism is the worldview one should take. Postmodernism, on the other hand, deconstructs for the sake of deconstruction. Yeah, it says that any attempt at construction, any ideology is totalitarian. Postmodernism is philosophical vandalism. It is the celebration of the deconstruction of all worldviews and the belief that any attempt to create a grand narrative for humanity or any attempt to define reality objectively is somehow totalitarian. That is postmodernism. So we are not postmodernists. And postmodernism is largely the ideology of the people we live under, whether they be on the right or the left, right? That postmodern individualism, anti-totalitarianism, anti-populism really defines the society we live in, and that it is largely the New York intellectuals. It is their middle-class radicalism that broke with the Soviet Union and became molded into the American political establishment after the Second World War. That really defines the world that we live in. The West is under the domination of philosophical irrationalism and postmodernism. And the reason for that is because postmodernism and philosophical irrationalism are the ideology of the West taken to very extreme conclusions. The overthrow of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, right? The right to life, liberty, and property, the idea that individuals should not be imposed upon by society. That was the basis of the foundation of Western civilization, right? We came out of the Dark Ages, first with the Renaissance, then the Enlightenment, and the central view of both the Renaissance and the Enlightenment was a celebration of the individual and the right of the individual to break with the collective, the right of the individual to not conform. Now, at the time of the Enlightenment and at the time of the Renaissance, that meant your right to pick your own religion. That meant your right to speak your mind and advocate government policies that you wanted. That meant your right to associate with who you wanted to associate with. It meant your right to read the Bible for yourself and come to the conclusions about religion that were for you. But postmodernism takes that celebration of individualism and that demand that the individual not be imposed upon by the collective to very extreme conclusions, to the point that it argues that not only can the individual not be imposed on by the collective, but there cannot be any collective narrative. There cannot be any objective truth. There cannot be any order in the universe itself. That is what the postmodernist and the philosophical irrationalist argues. Not only can people not be forced to acknowledge a truth, but on top of that, there is no truth to begin with, right? And anyone who's trying to tell you that there is a real truth is themselves a totalitarian who is seeking to impose something on you. This is the ideology that we live in. And I see that there's a Rumble rant that's come in. I'm going to be answering all the questions in the second half of the show, like we always do. So keep the super chats, Rumble rants, Rockfin tips rolling in. I'm looking forward to answering people's questions. But this is important for people to understand. This is very, very important for people to understand. So that's a big part of the Center for Political Innovation worldview, the pedagogy that we've just put together. So there's a lot of different factors in what we talk about. We did publish our own edition of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels, because that book is so essential to understanding the Marxist worldview, and because it talks about overproduction, it talks about historical progress, it distinguishes between the utopian socialists and the scientific socialism of Marx. That is an important text that we do recommend. There are other texts that I recommend. First of all, I recommend anything written by William Z. Foster. I strongly recommend anything William Z. Foster wrote because William Z. Foster was a great American Marxist leader. There's one writer I frequently end up referring to, and that's Louise Strong. Louise Strong was a great journalist. She was a leader of workers in Seattle and in Washington State. She ended up living in the Soviet Union and then in China. And she wrote about the Russian Revolution and about the Chinese Revolution. And she wrote about them in a way that was fused with spirituality. Her father was a minister, and her first book that she wrote was about the power of prayer. And she compared Eastern prayers, the prayers of Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, with the prayers of Western Christians. And her first book was on the power of prayer. And in her writing on the Soviet Union and her writing on China, even though she was probably an atheist, I don't think anywhere she ever talked about believing in God. I think she was very much a sympathizer with the communists. There is a spirituality to her writing that is very, very strong. Her book, The Stalin Era, that she wrote, which was after the death of Stalin, after Khrushchev came to power and started bashing Stalin. She had lived in Stalin's Russia, and she had such a deep spiritual attachment to what had gone on there. She wrote a book about what she saw from her perspective, what Stalin's Russia was like, what it was like when Russia was fighting the Nazis, what it was like when that country was industrializing, what Stalin was like as a man, because she knew Stalin. She was the editor of the Moscow News, which was the English language newspaper in Moscow during the 1930s. And Stalin met with her many times. He came to the office of the Moscow News and talked to them. And she felt compelled in 1956 to write this book, The Stalin Era, about what it was like, what it was like to live in Stalinist Russia, and what it had meant for her. And she writes about the Soviet Union, and she writes about Stalin's Russia in very spiritual terms. She speaks of the Soviet people as pioneers, blazing new ground, building their country up from nothing, sacrificing and working hard. She also wrote an autobiography called I Change Worlds, the remaking of an American, and how she as an American came to feel at home in the Soviet Union. And what's interesting is that Anna Louise Strong, she wrote these things, but eventually she was deported from the Soviet Union. They accused her of being a spy. And then it wasn't until Stalin's death that she was exonerated, and they said that she was not a spy. And then she spent the rest of her life in China. And in China, everyone knew her as the Paper Tiger Lady. That was what she was known as. She was the Paper Tiger Lady because it was her interview with Mao, right? She interviewed Mao Zedong. And in her interview with Mao, that's quoted in the Little Red Book, that's where Mao first used his phrase, the paper tigers. There's a whole chapter 6 of the Little Red Book. Got the Little Red Book here. On page 72 of the Little Red Book, she interviewed Mao, and Mao gave his quote, all reactionaries are paper tigers. In appearance, the reactionaries are terrifying, but in reality, they are not so powerful. From a long-term point of view, it is not reactionaries, but the people who are really powerful. And you'll see there it says, talk with American correspondent Anna Louise Strong. Anna Louise Strong was the Paper Tiger Lady, and she died in China. Her final years of her life were spent in China, where everyone called her the Paper Tiger Lady, right? Maybe she should have written a book called Battle Hymn of a Paper Tiger Lady. She'd had children. She could have been a paper tiger mom. I'm just kidding. But anyway, but that was Anna Louise Strong. And I recommend Anna Louise Strong's writings because it's full of information about what the Soviet Union and China was like. It's the other side of the story. It's sympathetic to China and the Soviet Union. But on top of that, in addition to that, it's got a very American and a very religious and spiritual quality to it. She is a Protestant. Her father is a Protestant minister, and her father was an abolitionist, an opponent of slavery, and her father was an advocate of social justice and a Bible-believing Christian, etc. And that his worldview and the worldview that Anna Louise Strong represents is a very Protestant and spiritual worldview that kind of flows through her writings. And that many times I have pointed out that Mao in particular, there was an odd connection between Mao and what you might call New England radicalism. For example, one of the biggest intellectual defenders of China was a guy named William Hinton. And I actually don't recommend his writings just because I've never really particularly enjoyed them. But he was one of the biggest pro-China writers from the 1950s and 60s that you'll find, William Hinton. And William Hinton, his family started the Putney School, which is was a very prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts, the Putney School. And it's a very Protestant, WASP, hard work, Quaker, through hard work, you can become more spiritual, etc. And that makes perfect sense. And the Putney School, I believe, is still around. And it's just a very, very prestigious and expensive boarding school for wealthy kids that follows the philosophy of, of the New England radicals who started it. And that worldview very much lines up with the worldview of the Maoists. And for whatever reason, Mao had a particular, connection to some degree or other with these kind of radical New England Protestants. To whatever degree there was some of the spirit of the Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening in the United States, it seemed that Mao had a spiritual connection with it. When we talk about the Second Great Awakening, we're talking about a widespread religious movement in the United States in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. That it was about repentance, and a lot of American Christianity can be traced back to that period. For example, the tradition of tent revival preaching, where they set up a tent and the pastor is in a tent preaching and waving the Bible around in a tent. They don't have an actual church; they have a tent outside someplace. That comes from the Second Great Awakening. The tradition of taking people out into the river and baptizing them in the river, that comes from the Second Great Awakening. There's many American religious sects and religious groups among Protestants that get traced back to the Second Great Awakening. The Seventh-day Adventists are one. The Mormons are another. And there were a number of new Protestant religious groups that were founded during this period. And that, the song Amazing Grace, right, which is sung, it's one of the most popular hymns in America. That was a Second Great Awakening song. And it was sung because it was about, the writer was a slave owner. And the story was that he went to Africa and he filled his slave ship full of black people, and he was taking them back to the United States. And then a storm came upon his ship, and he feared for his life, and he knew that slavery was wrong. He knew what he was doing to the African people was wrong. And so amid this storm, he feared for his life. He feared that he would die and go to hell for being a slave owner. So amid the thunderstorm, he promised God that if he could live, he would turn his ship around and he would take the black people back home. And when the storm went away, he fulfilled his promise and he turned that ship around and he took the black people back to Africa. And then he came back to the United States and he repented of his sins and was never involved in slavery again and became an abolitionist. And the song Amazing Grace, I guess, according to legend, who knows, this could have just been a marketing tactic, was written by this former slave owner who had a moment of great repentance and repented from slavery. And that was the theme of the Second Great Awakening. It was about repentance. It was about turning around, right? You're going in the wrong way. You're living in a sinful way, but you can change your life. You can start living in a moral way. It echoes the words of the prophet Jeremiah. It echoes the words of John the Baptist, especially when you're setting up tents, in the middle of the woods, a voice crying out in the wilderness. But everybody knows that what that was really about, what the Second Great Awakening was really about, it wasn't just that everyone just felt a need to get religious all of a sudden. What the Second Great Awakening was really about was that the country needed to turn around because the slaveholders had a grip on political power in Washington, D.C., that was preventing the country from developing. That's what it was really about. They were saying on an individual level, we need to repent. We need to become spiritually pure. We need to turn our lives around. We need to stop living in sin. We need to stop drinking and gambling, and we need to live a moral Christian life. But everyone knew that it was really an analogy for the country because the entire Second Great Awakening, all of these religious groups, from the Mormons to the Seventh-day Adventists to Charles G. Finney, my ancestor who set up Oberlin College, all of them were saying that slavery was wrong, and they were preparing for the fight ahead, which was to defeat slavery. That the slaveholders, because of the Electoral College and because of the way the U.S. was set up, they had a grip on the Supreme Court. They had a grip on the U.S. political establishment. And as a result of that, they were preventing the United States from industrializing. The northern industrial capitalists of Chicago and of New York City and Philadelphia, They wanted factories across America. They wanted industry. They wanted new technology, etc. The slaveholders wanted an agrarian economy. They wanted huge plantations to grow crops that they could export to London. The slave system of the South was very much at that point an extension of the British financial system, the British financial empire. Wall Street was very much a place that ensured slave exports. There had originally been a slave auction block on Wall Street, and that the Southern plantation system was part of the British Empire, part of the British financial system, whereas the Northern industrial centers, New Jersey, you had a lot of industrialization that went on there, Massachusetts. These things were separate. They were a thriving, booming economy in the United States. And there was a fight. There were two economies in America. There was a Southern plantation economy that was dominated by the British, and there was an independent Northern industrial economy. And that the Second Great Awakening was basically a mass radical movement fomented by the industrialists to try and mobilize against slavery. That's really what it was, is that, the way it was, the industrial capitalists wanted to defeat the slaveholders and defeat their power. And so in order to do it, they fomented a mass movement among the population to be anti-slavery. And in some cases, these abolitionists would kill slave owners. They would assassinate them. And some, my ancestor, Charles G. Finney, he refused to give communion. He had a church in Manhattan, and he refused to give communion to any person who was involved in the slave trade. And that made him very unpopular, and he was forced to flee to upstate New York because he got so many death threats and all of that. And eventually he moved his congregation out to Ohio, and he started Oberlin College. Charles G. Finney, that's my ancestor. And that, that this Second Great Awakening was New England radicalism. It was the industrial capitalists of New England fomenting among the working class and among the small farmers a religious zeal, a religious radicalism to defeat the slaveholders. And that's what it was. And it emphasized moral purity. It emphasized, as Louise Strong talks about, being right in her soul, living a moral and righteous life. It emphasized martyrdom, right? And John Brown, right? He was the ultimate martyr. He ended up getting the death penalty. He was the first American ever executed for treason because he tried to stage an armed uprising against slavery. And that, it was a wave of radicalism. And whatever was left of it, right? And a huge wave of radicalism that's that big is very hard to make it go away, right? And that after slavery was defeated, for a while you had the radical Republicans that were trying to redistribute land in the South. They were defeated by the moderate Republicans. You had the People's Party that was formed as a breakaway from the Republican Party, as the Republican Party was becoming an imperialist party, was shedding its revolutionary anti-slavery roots. You have the People's Party, which eventually became more and more racist. It started out as an anti-racist party of small farmers that opposed racism, but gradually racist demagogy became more and more part of the Republican or of the People's Party back in the 1860s, as it became more and more a party that was opposing the Republicans, trying to make the case that the Republicans had betrayed the working class. And so it started attacking the Republicans for being too sympathetic to black people. And gradually the People's Party became more and more racist and then dissolved into the Democratic Party. And it was William Jennings Bryan, who had been a leader of the People's Party, who became the first Democrat. He moved the People's Party into the Democratic Party, and the People's Party became the party of the Jim Crow Democrats. It dissolved into the Jim Crow Democratic Party. But for whatever reason, whatever was left of the Second Great Awakening, Louise Strong, whose father had been a leader of the Second Great Awakening, she was born in 1885. So, her father had become a minister and had caught the tail end of the Second Great Awakening and lived through the Civil War. William Hinton, whose family had set up the Putney School, Edgar Snow, whose father owned a printing press in St. Louis, Missouri, and had been, an anti-slavery radical in St. Louis, Missouri. Edgar Snow is a very famous pro-Chinese communist writer. Many of it, and Agnes Smedley, you can't forget Agnes Smedley, right? The feminist, the psychoanalyst and feminist of the 1920s, who had been a big supporter of India's struggle for independence and eventually became a Chinese communist sympathizer. There was a whole wave of kind of New England radicals, people whose roots were in the Second Great Awakening, who adopted the Maoist communist point of view in particular. For whatever reason, I think it was the emphasis on rebirth and self-criticism that was a big part of the Maoist communist tradition. I think that may have hit home with the New England radicals, as their emphasis was on repentance and turning one's life around. It may have been the kind of religious zeal and devotion you got with the Little Red Book or whatever. But for whatever reason, Mao Zedong connected with New England radicals. And that is a point of interest on these streams that has come up many times. I particularly like Louise Strong. I don't really enjoy William Hinton's writings. I've never gotten too much into Agnes Smedley either. But yeah, that comes up a lot on these streams as well. So I'm just trying to talk about the intellectual background of what it is that we discuss on these streams, the books that I recommend people read if they want to learn the worldview that we espouse on these streams. I've talked about the Yankee and Cowboy War, and that worldview comes from Carol Quigley. LaRouche also has that worldview. I've talked about the problem of overproduction and technology creating financial crisis, and I've named the 3 books that I recommend about that. As well as Fascism and Social Revolution, which is basically on the same theme, by R. Palm Dutt. I've talked about one theme that comes up a lot on these streams that is worth studying, that I often do recommend people look into, is the new communist movement of the 1970s. I urge people to read the history of the U.S. Civil War and the Communist Party of the United States. But, the 1970s new communist movement is very important. And there's a number of books that kind of go over its history. This is Revolution in the Air by Max L. Baum. I strongly recommend that book. And I also recommend Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, by Aaron Leonard and Conrad Gallagher. And both of those books are histories of the new communist movement, the NCM of the 1970s. And they talk about, it's a tragedy. The NCM, the new communist movement in the 1970s, is a very tragic period. There's another book that I do recommend also that is a complement to those two. It's called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, which is about the Maoist communist movement in Detroit, which is really the only place it was successful. The reason it's very difficult to read too much about the NCM, and I have spent a long time thinking about the NCM and the new communist movement, to the point that I even wrote this book, which is in the form of a letter to the leader of one of the leaders of one of the only remaining NCM groups, Letter to Bob Avakian. The reason I think a lot about the NCM is because it failed. It failed, but it was very much trying to do the right thing, which at this point the left is not, right? The woke left is not trying to do the right thing. They are not trying to get to the masses. They're not trying to win over the bulk of the people. They're not trying to, they're just virtue signaling. But the NCM was an attempt post World War II to do the right thing. The ground was just not fertile yet. The conditions in the country were not ones that the bulk of the population was able to be won over. The living standard among American industrial workers in the 1970s was just too high. And even though these groups did the best they could, and some of them accomplished a lot, they couldn't be successful. So it's a tragic history. You're reading about a movement that essentially failed. But But at the same time, you're reading about a movement that's wrangling with questions that are very much alive today, like the Boston busing riots, like the textbook riots in West Virginia. This question of a red-brown alliance, the idea that you should align with conservatives against the liberal establishment. And what if working class people have right-wing ideas but are at odds with the establishment? And that's an important question. The question of quote unquote white skin privilege, and this notion that somehow, white workers are just irredeemable and can never be won over. Well, that's bullshit. But that is a conclusion that many people came to based on the failure of the new communist movement. And that's something that we talk about on these streams. We talk about quite a bit. And so I do recommend people read Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. I recommend people read Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum. I recommend people read Heavy Radicals by Aaron Leonard. There's a follow-up book called Threat of Greatest Magnitude, which focuses on the FBI and its infiltration and how the FBI dealt with the new communist movement. All of these texts are very, very important. And that if we take this seriously, we should be studying constantly how we can be more effective at what we're doing. I think the worst thing that I can ever hear from anyone who talks about these ideas is, I don't want to know. Right? I've said many times on these streams, we've got 12 Palestinians dying every day. 12 Palestinians are dying every day. How on earth can we be satisfied with the conditions that we're facing right now? How can we be satisfied? We cannot be satisfied with these conditions, right? And with the fact that we have an economic crisis, we have a population that's more anti-war than they've ever been, right? More anti-war than they've ever been. But yet, at the same time, the communist groups are weaker than ever. Even interest in communism is rising, but yet we don't have a mass working class movement. We have a left that is isolated from the population overall. What is the problem? And if we're not wrangling with this, that's unacceptable, right? It's great. I am overjoyed that so many people are in the streets right now supporting the Palestinians. Except they're in the streets the same way they've been for 10 to 20 years. We've been seeing these Palestine rallies where the Muslim community and the left, the communist left, walk through the streets waving Palestinian flags, free, free Palestine, occupation is a crime. And the bulk of the American people look the other way. The bulk of the American people either see them and say, oh, that's a foreign rally, it's got nothing to do with me. The bulk of the American people see them and say, that's a group of scary-looking terrorists, and they walk the other way. The bulk of the American people say, oh, these are people that have been fighting for thousands of years, or it's really complicated. I don't know enough about geography and treaties. I can't argue about this. It doesn't have an impact on the population, right? And I refuse to be satisfied with that. I refuse to be satisfied with that. I just can't be satisfied with that. I want to see my country free from capitalism. I want to see a new world without imperialism. I want to see an America that is being reborn the way Russia and China have been reborn, with new roads and bridges and highways, with unemployment being eradicated, with education for all and healthcare for all. I want to see an America where growth and optimism and hopefulness is spreading. I want to see an America beyond the sinister agenda of the ultra-rich. And because of that, we have to wrangle with big questions. We have to demand better. We cannot be satisfied with the Palestine rallies the way they are. We cannot be satisfied with an irrelevant fringe left that has no impact in changing the country. We cannot be satisfied with the way things are and with the answers that these outdated groups give. And I just will not be satisfied. I will not be satisfied with the conditions that the way they are. I just will not do it. And so based on that, because I am not satisfied, because I do want to change the world and I refuse to just be satisfied, I have continued to organize. And me and a lot of very great people in the Center for Political Innovation, we continue to organize. I just found out today, I was posting on Facebook, this book, right? We Are City Builders. I did not know this. This is the Center for Political Innovation textbook. I just found this out today. I had no idea. This book is being used in the classes being given at the Laundry Workers Center. Virgilio, who's a leader of the Laundry Workers Center, he watches these streams. He has copies of this book, and he has been using this book in his classes. Somebody who's not part of CPI, someone I've met a few times, an activist in New York City. He's got a group that organizes workers, that supports labor unions, and he's been using our textbook in his classes. That's great. That's tremendous news. I had absolutely no idea, but he's been doing this for a couple of years now. He uses different books to teach the people in his trade union organizing center about socialism, and one of the books that he uses is this book. And I am beyond honored to hear that Virgilio and the Laundry Workers Center have been using our book. That's tremendous. That's great. And that's exactly why we were formed, is we were formed because we want to produce new material to spread these ideas to bigger audiences and get more people to understand these concepts in ways that other forces are failing to do. And the fact that an actual working class labor union organizing center is using this, there are workers at the Laundry Workers Center who are getting taught about socialism from this book. That is a huge victory. That's a huge victory. Now, another thing that I also have found out is today in Washington, D.C., there was a massive pro-Palestine rally, and there was also a massive rally to support the Uhuru movement against the FBI indictment that they are facing. There was a big rally to support the People's Democratic Uhuru movement against the FBI, and that Chairman O'Malley, he personally thanked CPI on numerous occasions today. He spoke with our people, told them how much he supports us, how much he appreciates our support. The Uhuru movement, they see that we are doing all we can to support them, that we have sent people to their events and rallies to support them, that we have highlighted their case at all of our conventions. They have sent, that we made this film, that Peter Coffin made this beautiful movie, Money in American Injustice, about their case and what they're facing. They really, really appreciate our work. I also find that to be a big, big honor. And I'm very, very honored. And we were invited onto the stage. There were a number of communist groups that attended the rally that were not invited onto the stage. But we, the Center for Political Innovation, our member, John McCarthy, was invited to give a speech at the rally, the Uhuru rally. And he gave a very good speech. And I'm waiting for the video of that speech to be available. I will be putting it up on YouTube. That's really, really important. We're doing very, very, very important work. And I'm honored. I'm really, really glad at what we've accomplished. I'm really, really glad that our textbooks are being used. I'm really, really glad that the Uhuru movement celebrates and appreciates the support that we're giving them. And so based on that, I just want to give you all an update. For those of you who may not be aware, there's going to be a very, very important conference happening very, very soon in Portland, Oregon. Scott Ritter, Jyoti Brar, Garland Nixon, David Rovics, Rainer Shea, Lee Stranahan. Many people are coming to Portland, Oregon for an all-day mega anti-imperialist rally that is set to take place on December 2nd. It's going to be really, really great, and we need you there. We need you to come. So if you can please come to the rally, we need you in Portland. It's going to be the biggest event of the year. We have never done a conference of this size. We never have. It's a big effort on our part. So we need you to come. So if you're coming, we need you to register for the event. So please just go to the site and register. Let us know that you're coming. It is a free event. You can donate if you want, but it's free. So register for the event. We need you to register for the event, to let us know that you're planning to be there. That's going to be important. So please register for the event. I'm just dropping it on the Rumble, dropping it everywhere. Register for the event. We need you there. And on top of that, right now funds are a little bit tight. We're doing a lot. Let me tell you, and let me, show you what we are doing right now. I just want you to see this. If you haven't seen it already, I want you to see this, right? There is a huge amount of outreach going on right now. We just had a meeting this afternoon. This is the outreach materials that we have. Now, we have posters that are going up on telephone poles and on walls. We have door knockers that are being hung on the doors of houses in residential neighborhoods. Right? In addition to that, we have palm cards that are being shoved under doors, that are being left in coffee shops, that are being left in restaurants, etc. We are just blitzing the area in Portland where the conference is being held, in the Portland metropolitan area. We are blitzing the area with these posters. And there's a lot of work that remains to be done, but we are going to fill up that hall of 250 people. We have transportation that we can provide for people. We have transportation. We have people coming in from Seattle. We have people coming in from Northern California. This is going to be a huge, huge event. This is going to be a big, big conference that we are doing. We have never done anything remotely as big as what we are doing on December 2nd. This will be the biggest event that CPI has done yet. And right now, there's no way around it. We need more money. In order to do the best job we can do, and people have contributed, and it's going to happen. I mean, there's no turning back. This event is happening. But in order to do the best job that we can do, we need contributions. So if you can support the event, if you can send a contribution to help support the conference, Give, Send, Go is the best way to send a contribution. If you can send your contribution on Give, Send, Go, that would be really, really great. I'll drop that on the Rockfin, on the Rumble, etc. But we would really appreciate it if you can help us support the event. We have never done anything this large, and Portland is the city to do it in. It really is. And that this is going to be quite an event. It's going to be quite an event. And that is what I am focused on. When I was flying to Russia, I was thinking about Portland. When I was flying back from Russia, I was thinking about Portland. When I was working out at the gym the other day, I was thinking about Portland. I've been calling people around the clock. We are obsessed with making the Portland conference a success. We are obsessed. We have never gone as all in on an event as we are going all in on this. This event is going to be, we are going to end the year of 2023 with a bang. We are going to end this year with a bang. We are going to give it all we've got, because anti-imperialism is needed now more than ever. It is time to get out of the movement and to the masses. And so we really could appreciate, and we really would love your support. If you're able to help us, with our conference, if you're able to be there, just being there is support. Be there, bring a friend, bring a family member, bring a coworker, help us promote online. We have an online promotion team of people that are working to do online promotion. This event will be a smashing success. And we need you there to witness the success. We need you there to be part of the success. Our movement, our time has come. It is the time for us to do what we are doing. Everything I've been talking about on these streams, out of the movement to the masses. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Now is the time to make it happen. Right now, we're swimming upstream. It is hard to do what we're doing. We're not getting rewards. We're not getting boosted by other online communities, but that's because the time has come to just do it. Just get to the masses. There's no shortcuts. There's no alternatives. There's no internet advertising. The time has come to just get to the masses. We must get to the masses. And we're doing it. And we're hanging door knockers on their doors. And we're shoving palm cards underneath their doorstops. And we're postering up their neighborhoods. And we are doing it. It is the time, and it must be done now. So I wanted to let you all know about that. We had an amazing Zoom call this afternoon with, if I added up everyone who was on, about 15, 16 people were on. It was mostly 12 people that were on for the whole time, but there were different people that were on. If you added up everyone who was on, it was at 15, maybe 16 people that were on our Zoom call this afternoon. We're doing great stuff, and I am inspired by everyone. Also, go check out our website, cpiusa.org. We have news articles that are going up. Support spreads for peace conference. That's the latest article that has just gone up on the website. You can look. You can look at different articles that have been published. Anti-war activism outgrows the anti-war movement by John McCarthy. We're publishing new articles all the time on the website now. If you go to the news section of our website, we're now, for a while we were kind of, in a rut. We weren't publishing news articles, but now news articles are being published. So, check out news articles. And that's really great. And, we have comrades writing them who are doing a great job. Our organization is moving ahead because we have a serious task to take on. So I want to encourage you all to get involved. We need you to join. Well, it's about time to just join, become a CPI member, get involved in all of this. But yes, exciting things are happening. So these are my opening remarks for tonight. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. We are now having our roll call. Names and locations. Who is with us? We got Mark Jones in Utica, New York. Welcome, Mark. Sam from Missouri. Gonzalo in Argentina. Pumpkin, the cat in Pittsburgh. I gave an Uber driver our CPR card. We were talking about Burkina Faso. Very good. Gabby is in Chicago, and she does great work. Gabby's in Chicago. Colin in Greensboro. Panos in Greece. Carl in Washington. Catalonia, Spain. Patch in Arizona. David in Bermuda. Timoshenko, he's out in St. Louis. He's doing great work. He's done some Uhuru Solidarity work as well. Great stuff. Ferris Ingle, Bromley, UK. What is BDS? I'm not familiar with BDS. Well, send a super chat. We can talk about that. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Meredith and Quinn, Washington State. Katusha in Belarus. Bum, 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 bum. Oh, everyone's here tonight. Carolyn and Dario in Brooklyn are here. Welcome. Chris in Salt Lake City is here. Emmett in Dallas is here. Phil Sang in Miami, Florida is here. Sherry Cape in New Jersey is here. Karen Mendes in Germany is here. Bob Troy in New York is here. Right? Moonlight Beach, Scott S. David Fox is on the road. David Fox out in Australia. Al Kader. Chris in Salt Lake City. Patrick in Maine, Sydney, Australia, Moonlight Beach, California, Trick or Treat Pumpkin from Pennsylvania, Saviero from Mexico. Welcome. Names and locations. Kathleen Thornig says, hi, Caleb from Richmond. Hello. Oh, no, Caitlin from Richmond. Welcome, Caitlin. Glad you're watching, Caitlin. All right. Leslie from Australia. Welcome. So glad to have folks here with us. We're doing great stuff around the country. We appreciate everyone who is a part of our community. Time to join the Center for Political Innovation, become a member. It's time to send a super chat if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of our show. I'm going to start answering people's questions. I have one Rumble rant. And I will answer that. And then after that, I'll do super chats. So send some more super chats. I've only got 3 of them here to answer. So I will just start. I will start answering them. This is first the Rumble rant. This one says, Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity was a surprising disappointment to me. Emotional straw man from start to finish. Yeah, I will say, when I was in college, I was frustrated with how people just refused to listen to what I would say, mainly about foreign policy. People just had this blind spot where they just Russia bad, China bad. And I remember I read Thus Spake Zarathustra. And that book, it made me feel better because I felt like I was a misunderstood person. I felt like people were going after me. I felt like I was making everybody mad, and it appealed to me, right? And that's the appeal of philosophical irrationalism. It's kind of like 1984. When I read 1984, when I was I was quite young when I read 1984, but it's about nonconformity, right? And that philosophical irrationalism appeals to the nonconformist, right? It appeals to the person who feels like society doesn't understand them. It appeals to the person who's been in the minority and taken the minority position, who's felt persecuted by the majority. It appeals to the person who feels like other people are not as smart as they are. That's the appeal of Nietzsche, right? And all of us who are communists in this society have an element of that, right? You have to admit that. If you're smart enough to become a communist in America, there's going to be a part of you that feels like you're smarter than everybody else and that you're persecuted for being smart. There's going to be a part of you that is non-conforming and sees conformity as dangerous. And that is why philosophical irrationalism is very appealing to the kind of person that would become a communist. It makes very effective anti-communist propaganda. 1984, you remember George Orwell was a Trotskyite communist for a while, right? That he fought in Spain with the POUM, the Workers' Party of Spain or whatever, the Trotskyite militia in Spain, and that if you feel like you are a smart person, and if you feel like your friends and coworkers, aren't as smart as you, and that you've been persecuted for your intelligence, that kind of stuff is very, very effective. It's that much more sophisticated anti-communist propaganda. And Nietzsche was a very intelligent man, but he had contempt for the masses. But he also had a huge dose of might makes right. And he seemed to believe that compassion was a form of weakness. He seemed to celebrate nonconformity, not just in the form of not thinking what everyone else is thinking, but not recognizing the rights of others, right? This is kind of like how Ayn Rand admired William Hickman. When Ayn Rand first moved to the United States, true story, you read any biography of Ayn Rand, they'll talk about a guy named William Hickman. Ayn Rand fled the Soviet Union, came to the United States, was living with her family in Chicago, and there was a guy named William Hickman who lived in Chicago, and he murdered his wife. He thought his wife was cheating on him, so he strangled his wife to death. And in Chicago, he was found guilty of murder. And the judge said that if the man would repent, and say that, apologize for murdering his wife, he would not get the death penalty. And the man said, no, she deserved to die. She cheated on me, that bitch. I don't feel any remorse. And he got the death penalty. Ayn Rand developed a crush on William Hickman. She had a photograph of him in her bedroom, and she was just in awe of a wife strangler. Why? Because he wouldn't obey the rules. He wouldn't conform. Society said it was a bad thing to kill one's wife, but he made his own rules. No one told him what to do. He murdered his wife. And that is Nietzsche, right? It's celebrating nonconformity, not just in thinking what you want to think or challenging the prevailing social order, but in refusing to recognize the rights of others, right? William Hickman, his wife may have been an awful person, but she deserved life. She did not deserve to die for whatever went on in their marriage. I don't know what the circumstances were. I think he thought she was cheating on him, whatever, but he had no right to murder his wife. But Ayn Rand thought that the fact that this man could rewrite the ethical and moral code in his mind to say that he could kill his wife for cheating on him, that made him heroic. And that's very Nietzschean, right? Nietzsche admires the person who writes their own moral code, refuses to play by the rules of society, asserts his own individual will. Well, that is the law of the jungle, right? And Nietzsche would admit that, right? You read what Nietzsche wrote about the blonde beast. He admired the law of the jungle. He admired might makes right. His belief in nonconformity really merged with a belief that if you enact your will onto society with force and violence. That makes you right because you're bold. And that is a very, very dangerous type of thinking. And Nietzsche very much worshipped the overdog, just like Ayn Rand. He worshipped those in positions of power, and he lacked sympathy for those in positions of weakness. And because of that, he hated Christianity. He said a doctrine of the lowly makes for lowliness. And he saw Christianity as a religion that gives consolation to the lowly. It gives consolation to people that are oppressed and suffering, right? It says that they will get justice. There will be redemption, etc. And he hated that. He wanted people to just be ruthless. He wanted people to respond to their oppression by becoming like their oppressors and being even more beastly than their oppressors in order to prove that they were the superior ones. And that's the Nietzschean philosophy. And yes, it's very anti-Christian, but it equates communism with Christianity. And many on the far right, the far right, have always done this. Oswald Spengler says the same thing. He says, the basis of Bolshevism is Christianity. And this is true, right? That communism is just a scientific, non-spiritual version of Christianity. Christianity is just a religious and spiritual version of communism. Christianity was the movement of the ancient Roman proletariat who worshipped Jesus the carpenter, who believed that they could tear down the empire and create a society where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Who believed that only those who labor and produce wealth can be saved, that dignity comes through working and the creation of wealth, and that usury and the lending of money was sinful and contrary, but you should create wealth and share all that's created. And actually, many people don't know. This was pointed out on our Zoom call today by Noah. Shout out to you if you're watching, Noah in Boston. That the phrase that Karl Marx uses, from each according to his own ability, from each according to his need, comes from the Bible. Did you know that? It comes from the Bible. I will read it to you, right? Comes from two places in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, in two different places, it references that. In Acts 4:35, in Acts 4:35. Let me pull up Acts, right? Acts 4. We'll do the KJV, King James Bible. Right? In Acts 4:35, in Acts 4, it says, "And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and one soul, and neither said any of them that ought the things which he possessed that were his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power gave the apostles witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, and great grace was upon them all. And neither was there any among them that lacked, for all, as many as were possessors of land or houses, sold them and brought the prices of the things that were sold and laid them down at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made unto every man according to as he had need." That is Acts verse 4:32 to 4:35. Right? But it's elsewhere in the book of Acts as well. It's not just in Acts 4:35. Right? Well, we'll pull up. There's another place in the book of Acts. It says the same thing. It's Acts, I believe it's Acts 2:45, right? Do Acts 2, King James. Right. So it's Acts okay. Yeah, it's Acts 2 verses 43. Acts 2:42. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking bread and in prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed were together and had all things in common. And they sold their possessions and goods and parted them to all men, as every man had need. And they continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, and did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God and having favor with all people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. So in two different places in the book of Acts, Acts 2 and Acts 4, it makes clear that distribution was made according to need. So when Karl Marx referred to communism as each according to his own ability, each according to his need, he was actually making kind of a joke. He was referring to the Bible, right? And he was critiquing, it was in critique of the Goethe program. And he was critiquing a socialist manifesto written by social democrats, the Goethe program of the German Social Democratic Party, many of whom were Christians. Many of whom were Christians. And he was saying, well, the only way you can get this kind of Christian socialism is you have to create vast material abundance. And he's saying only then can you have each according to his own ability and each according to need. And Karl Marx, who's an atheist, is kind of taunting the Christian socialists by using that phrase. And it's weird because that phrase has become, Tyler says, meanwhile, the local rich church wouldn't buy my friend a pair of diapers. Wow. But Marx in his own way was kind of taunting these kind of Christian socialists in Germany by basically kind of making fun of their, the fact that they were trying to create, the Acts of the Apostles. They wanted distribution according to need. And Marx is saying the only way you can really get distribution according to need is you have to eradicate scarcity entirety. So that whole concept, according to need, is just very, very misunderstood. It's become a phrase that they attack socialists and all of that with, and it's Marx making a joke and referencing the Bible. So there you go. There you go. I hope that answered your question, Benzo Beans. There you go. So now I've got 3 super chats here that I'm going to answer. If anyone has any more super chats, now would be the time to send them. If not, we'll be ending the show pretty soon. So first one is, what happened to Navalny? He was kind of a fascist. My understanding is that Navalny is in prison in Russia, right? And isn't he in prison for tax fraud or something like that? He's in prison, right? He was disrupting. He was. Russia's in a state of war right now. The population is being called up to serve in the military. There's a violent pro-NATO regime right on their border that's been slaughtering their people. They've had to take in 2 to 3 million refugees. Russia's got their special military operation moving in to protect the people of Donetsk and Lugansk who voted to join with Russia. In a state of war, Navalny is disrupting the war effort, right? And he's a pro-American guy. He's also an ethnic supremacist who believes that certain ethnic groups in the Caucasus Mountains are no good. He's praised Hitler, etc. And he's an anti-Russian, agent of the United States who is disrupting the war effort, and causing instability in the country. He can't run for president legally, but yet he, somehow American media always highlights that he can't legally run for president as if it's rigged against him. I was in Russia. I saw this when I was at the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2017, and leaders of the Election Commission were speaking, etc. And, Navalny's supporters, because he's a felon, he can't run for office until a certain date because he's been convicted of crimes. And yet his supporters try to make it sound like, he's being persecuted. He's being blocked from the ballot. Well, no, their law says that if you've been convicted of a crime, you can't run for office until a certain date. And it's just, he's just there to make trouble. Right? There are a lot of people in Russia that have disagreements with the government one way or the other. You have the Communist Party. They disagree. They want Russia to have more social programs, more of a welfare state. You have the Liberal Democratic Party that wants Russia to be more military and authoritarian. They want to outlaw Islam. They want to bring back the death penalty. there's a lot of different political views in Russia. Okay. Navalny, however, he represents the views that the Americans want to highlight. He represents the views of the Americans who want to take Russia apart. They want to break apart Russia as a country, and Navalny can't legally run for office, but they always make it sound like he's being persecuted. He's referred to people of certain nationalities as being cockroaches who need to be exterminated. Not a good dude. And my understanding is that he's currently in prison in Russia, if I'm not mistaken, right? Navalny, I believe he's in prison in Russia, if I'm not mistaken. He's just one of these professional oppositionists. And they call him anti-corruption, which is like, give me a break, right? He's just an anti-Putin advocate. So yeah, that's Navalny. All right. Thoughts on Alexander Finnegan? I really honestly don't know that much about him, but my understanding, he's an anti-imperialist. He's an Irish person who has anti-imperialist views and has faced a lot of internet smearing and persecution and harassment. And because of that, he's fled to different parts of the world. Because of the harassment that he was enduring, because of his anti-imperialist views. I believe he was on Quora, which is like a questioning website. It's like where people ask questions. It's one of those sites. He was on there, and he was pro-Russian, anti-imperialist. He was a fan of my work and my streams, among other things. Kind of like a Max Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore fan, anti-imperialist guy in Ireland. And just like anybody else who becomes outspoken and anti-imperialist at this time, he got smeared. And the smears, the smears made it very, very difficult for him to continue living in Ireland. And so he's had to flee to other countries. I think he was in Honduras for a while. I don't know where he's currently at. But he's a good friend of Rainer, who I interviewed last night. I had a great chat with Rainer Shea. We ended up talking for like 2 hours, and my internet went off, and so I did it on my phone. It was wild. But Rainer and Alexander, I believe, are very good friends. I don't know Alexander that well. I do know he has faced persecution. It was worse. He had to flee to Guatemala. All right, so he's in Guatemala. See, I couldn't keep track of it, and I am not that familiar with the case, but I just know that he is an outspoken anti-imperialist from Ireland, and he has faced a lot of persecution. All right, we'll answer that. And any more super chats, we'll go from there. So next, if Marxism-Leninism was designed to serve the Soviet Union, can someone be truly ML after 1991? Well, I'm telling you, as someone who speaks for myself, I don't think you can, right? I think that, if you read my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, which I recommend, right? This is the textbook of CPI. The opening essay kind of lays out, my worldview. If you read my book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution, ML is a very, very big influence on how I see things. I'm heavily influenced by Marxism-Leninism, but I don't think you can be a pure ML in our time because pure ML was designed to serve the Comintern, right? And just like I don't think you can use pure democratic centralism in our time to organize. It's just not an effective thing with our modern means of information and the way people think nowadays. You can't build a democratic centralist organization in our time. I just don't think that's the way you should be organizing. It's just not an effective way. At the same time, I don't think you can be a pure ML. I think we can draw heavily Lenin's definition of imperialism, Lenin's understanding of the state and how important the state question is. What else? There's many issues that are drawing. I mean, Lenin and his understanding of what is to be done, and the concept of the party of new time. I mean, Lenin, the national question, anti-imperialism. Lenin is a brilliant thinker. His critique of ultra-leftism, his writing on tactics. There's so much you can draw from Lenin, right? And we should read all of that stuff. What is to be done? The state and revolution. Left-wing communism and infantile disorder, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the three components of Marxism. That's a very good essay that I recommend people read. Imperialism and the split in socialism, which writes about the corruption that led to, all these socialist parties supporting World War I. Lenin's writings are very good and very essential. That said, I don't think you can be a pure ML in our time because the conditions have changed, the means of information have changed, and that Lenin was one of the most successful revolutionaries. And, I remember when I was in college, I recall how I said that I was studying political science, and I said we should read Lenin's book, The State and Revolution. We should read that book. And the argument that I gave for why we should read that book was because at one point, 2/3 of the human race lived under governments that were based on that book. That book, The State and Revolution, lays out the Marxist-Leninist theory of government. And if you want to understand how the Soviet government functioned, how the Cuban government functions, how the Chinese government functions, the Vietnamese government functions, if you want to understand how the many, many, many governments around the world, the Constitution of Angola, the Constitution of Zimbabwe, the Constitution of, so many countries, their theory of government and their political system is based on the theories that Lenin puts forward in the book, The State and Revolution. And based on that, you should read the book, The State and Revolution, if you're studying comparative politics. But we didn't read it in college. And I said, how can we understand the political systems of the world if we're not studying the theoretical book that is the basis for the government of so many different countries, right? If you're just a student of political science, you should read The State and Revolution. It's mandatory, right? And it's a book where he talks about what the state is, where the state came from, what a capitalist state is, what a socialist state is, how the state will fade away under communism. And if you want to understand many of the governments in the world, you have to read The State and Revolution by Lenin. And it's a very clearly written book. And Terry says they didn't want you to understand. And she's right. She's right. They don't want you to understand. But it's pretty basic. Pretty basic. So there we go. Now, why did Ceausescu condemn the 1968 intervention? He's referring to the Soviet intervention in Prague. Well, I can't tell you directly. I haven't studied it, but I can tell you the context of that. Ceausescu was the leader of Romania. Romania was a country that was liberated by the Soviet Union after World War II. And in all the countries that were liberated by Soviet troops, they did not impose communism on those countries. That's a myth that we often hear. They imposed communism. They did not. The government that was formed in Romania, just like the government in Czechoslovakia, just like the government in East Germany, right, was what they called a people's democratic government. It was a coalition government made up of all the different forces that opposed the Nazis. Anyone who supported the Nazis was banned from serving in the government. But it was a government made up of different anti-Nazi fighters. So in Romania, you had the Communist Party, but you also had the Social Democratic Party. You had different democratic activist groups, religious groups that had fought the Nazis, etc. And they all formed a coalition government. And these were called People's Democratic Governments. That was the term that was used by the Soviet Union for the Warsaw Pact countries, because they weren't communist governments yet. They were people's democratic or popular democratic governments. The Soviet Union would help these countries have more economic development and provide aid to these countries, build hospitals and schools and railroads, and they would mobilize. The Soviet Union helped these countries, and eventually the different parties that had fought the Nazis would merge into one party. And they would agree on kind of a socialist program for the country. But it wasn't the Communist Party. In Germany, it was the Socialist Unity Party, was the name of the ruling party of East Germany. It wasn't the Communist Party. In North Korea, it was the People's Democracy, and it was the Korean Workers' Party, not the Korean Communist Party. Well, Romania had been a People's Democratic government. However, in the 60s, Ceausescu, he thought that Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership were a little bit too mild. So he undertook the reform to transform Romania from being a people's democracy to being a full socialist society. And he launched like his own like cultural revolution. And it's very clear that even though Ceausescu remained in the Soviet camp, he was saying, we want to be more communist than the Soviet Union. And he didn't cut off. I think he was friendly to China to some degree. He didn't completely side with China. It wasn't like Albania where he denounced the Soviets, but he was kind of like Cuba. He was kind of like, North Korea, where he was still somewhat friendly to the Chinese. And it's very clear that the Soviets thought Ceausescu, they didn't trust him and they didn't want him. He changed the name of the ruling party of Romania from I forget what it was called, to the Communist Party of Romania. And he declared that Romania was a full socialist state, that they weren't a people's democracy, and that he saw himself as more radical than the Soviet leaders, and that he wanted to implement a more egalitarian form of socialism in Romania. And some people suspect he was doing this because there were nationalists in Romania who felt that we're trying to portray the communists of Romania as being, Russia's bitch. Oh, Russia's just kicking the communists around. They're just puppets of the Russians. Well, Ceausescu wanted to prove he wasn't a puppet of the Russians. And so he adopted a more radical communist stance for Romania. And so in 1968, what happened in Czechoslovakia was that Dubček took power in Czechoslovakia, and he also had a divergent opinion. He was not a pro-Soviet communist. He called himself a democratic socialist, or a socialist with a human face. And that really meant he was pro-Western. He was pro-American. He was a CIA guy, right? He immediately cut off aid to the Vietnamese people, etc. But Dubček broke with the Soviet line, okay? And the Soviet Union saw that Dubček was going to set up like a NATO position behind the Iron Curtain. He was going to turn Czechoslovakia into an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet base area in the name of democratic socialism. So the Soviet Union mobilized its forces to go into Czechoslovakia to back up the majority of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party that opposed Dubček, and to militarily intervene to remove Dubček. I can imagine that Ceausescu felt that set a precedent that could be done to him. That because he was betraying the Soviet line, he wasn't following the Soviet position, that, look, they removed Dubček, he wasn't following the Soviet position, they could remove me, and I'm not following the Soviet position. Now, that may have been how he felt, right? That this was a threat to the sovereignty of the countries of Eastern Europe. However, they didn't remove Ceausescu, right? And Ceausescu continued to move away from the Soviet Union. Eventually, Romania got into huge debt to American banks, and the 1980s in Romania were awful. It was just awful in Romania in the 1980s. They lost a lot of money because they had to pay back these loans to American banks. It was really bad for their economy. And Romania economically pulled further and further away from the Soviet Union, and it hurt their economy. But regardless, the Soviet Union didn't intervene to overthrow Ceausescu, because Ceausescu was not trying to turn Romania into an outpost of NATO expansionism. He wasn't pro-imperialist. Ceausescu was anti-imperialist. He wasn't Dubček. Dubček was pro-imperialist. Dubček, it was like Tito. Tito, he became a pro-NATO, anti-Soviet figure. I mean, Tito became a full-on anti-communist. Whereas in Dubček was a full-on anti-communist, Ceausescu was asserting his independence from the Soviet Union. So I would assume that is why he condemned it. What's important to note, and this is very interesting, make sure that's true, that Ceausescu actually condemned it. Because many places you will read that Fidel Castro condemned the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. He did not. If you actually read what Fidel Castro said about the Soviet intervention into Czechoslovakia, he said the Soviet Union was right to go in, but he said that the Soviet Union had mismanaged their relationship with Czechoslovakia and let things get so bad that they'd created an opening for Dubček to come in. And he said the Soviet Union was responsible for the situation that had given birth to Dubček, and that the Soviet Union had not been good to Czechoslovakia, and their relationship with Czechoslovakia had not been proper, etc. And that had given rise to Dubček. But he said, yes, it was right for them to move in. And then Fidel Castro said, he challenged the Soviet leaders. And he said, now, would you send troops to Cuba if a similar situation developed here? He said, we challenge you. Would, if counter-revolutionaries came to power in Cuba, would you send troops to back us up? So Fidel Castro loudly criticized the Soviet Union at the time of the 1968 intervention in Czechoslovakia. But Fidel Castro did not oppose the Soviets moving the troops in. He just said that the situation was the result of the Soviet Union's mismanagement. And that is a really, really important point. But many, many places you will read Trotskyites and others, and just mainstream American media, claiming that Fidel Castro opposed sending troops into Czechoslovakia. He didn't do that. So because of that, it's very careful. Did Ceausescu actually condemn the intervention, or did he just blame the Soviet Union for creating a situation that gave rise to it? Which I think is a very fair point to make. I think there probably were decisions and policies by the Soviet leaders toward Czechoslovakia that made it easier for Dubček to take power. And I think that's a fair point to make. But at the end of the day, the Soviet Union was defending socialism and defending anti-imperialism, and Dubček was an agent of the imperialists. So the Soviet Union was right to move into Prague in 1968. But the crisis that had emerged in Prague, you could argue that, yeah, the Soviet Union did a lot to make things worse that it got to that point. Now, China at that point had cut ties with the Soviet Union. China condemned the intervention into Czechoslovakia, but they were anti-Soviet at that point, so that's not really surprising. But it's possible that Ceausescu did condemn it. But I'm just telling you the context. It makes sense, but be sure that he actually did. One of the best stories that I ever heard was that there was an activist in Cleveland, Ohio. His name was Ted Dostal, and he was a steel worker. He was a huge man, a communist, a Workers' World Party member, a huge guy, Finnish guy from Minnesota. Just a huge man. He'd been a steel worker. He'd been a high school English teacher. He was a communist. And when the 1968 Democratic National Convention happened in Chicago, he went to Chicago and he led the young people in protesting against the Democratic Convention because they nominated a pro-war candidate. And he taught them how to make barricades out of park benches, how to pick up park benches and turn them into barricades to fight the police with, as the striking workers had done on the picket lines in Minneapolis and elsewhere. And he was this man, they called him the Iron Man. That's what the police department's code name for him. He was Iron Man Ted Dostal. He was just this very well-loved communist leader from Cleveland, Ohio. And he was a member of the Workers' World Party, and he was in the streets of Chicago. 1968 Democratic Convention was a bloodbath, right? Many of the people who were protesting against the Democratic Convention for being in support of the Vietnam War, when the majority of Democrats wanted to end the Vietnam War, many of the people who were protesting were beaten up very badly. There was a lot of street fighting that went on, and this was this old communist who was leading the young people and teaching them how to fight in the streets, etc. But then one night, after they'd spent the day in the streets fighting against the police and organizing against the convention, then students for a democratic society and the weather underground people or whatever, I mean, that's who they eventually became, Bernardine Dorn, Bill Ayers, all of them, they said, all right, well, tonight we're going to go protest the Soviet Union, the Soviet consulate, because they invaded Czechoslovakia. And Ted said, no, I'm not going to that. I support the Soviet Union. They're defending socialism from Dubček, who's an agent of American imperialism. I'm not going to go do that. And Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn and the Weathermen said, oh, but, we want to gain credibility. We want to gain, people will see that we protested the Soviet Union too, and then they'll see that we're honest in protesting the Vietnam War. We have to do this. We have to protest the Soviet Union, because then people will see that we're against all invasions. We're against military invasions of any country. We have to. And Ted said, I'm not concerned about being popular. I'm concerned about being right. And that that the Soviet intervention into Czechoslovakia is right, and the U.S. intervention into Vietnam is wrong, and that the U.S. imperialists are on one side of the global class war, and the Soviet Union and the Soviet people and the workers and the farmers of Czechoslovakia that don't like the rich counterculture hippie kids who are in love with American culture and wearing blue jeans and listening to Beatles, they're on the other side. And that Ted Dostal had a big fight with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn and the Weathermen because he was not interested in helping them protest against the Soviet consulate in in 1968 at the Democrat Convention. And that's how liberal kind of people think. They think that if they just take the side of the imperialists, if they just take the side of the mainstream media on some issues, then they'll stop calling them traitors. They'll stop calling them Russian agents. It doesn't work that way. You gain nothing. And did it stop, right? Did the American media say that the Vietnam anti-Vietnam protesters, did they see them protesting the Soviet embassy and say, oh, see, they're honest. They're not traitors. They're not. Of course not, right? It didn't make any difference. And you should never fall into that trap of thinking that if you condemn something that Russia does, you condemn something that China does, you condemn something that Iran does, that way people will listen to you when you criticize the American government. Doesn't work that way. What they do is they say, wow, even the communists condemn China. Wow, even the communists condemn Russia. It never works in your favor. You should never give an inch to the imperialists, ever, on any issue, right? And that condemning the Soviet intervention into Czechoslovakia did not in any way help the anti-war movement. And Ted Dostal knew that. And he was an older communist. He was a steel worker. And even though he was happy to march in the streets and teach these young people how to fight the police and how to use barricades use park benches as barricades or whatever, he was not interested in opposing and protesting the Soviet intervention into Czechoslovakia. And that is an important story that I heard about that. 1968 Democratic National Convention. So I thought I would share that with you. The Prague Spring, look, if the Prague Spring had won, what happened in 1989 and 1990 across Eastern Europe would have happened earlier in 1968. We saw what the counter-revolution brought in country after country after country. Did it bring freedom? Did it bring liberty? Did it bring lots of wealth? No. It brought sex trafficking. It brought heroin. It brought unemployment. It brought starvation. The life expectancy went down in Romania. It went down in Czechoslovakia. It went down in Lithuania. It went down in Moldova. It went down in Estonia. It went down in Hungary. It went down in Yugoslavia. It went down in Albania. Every single one of those countries in Eastern Europe that used to have a Marxist-Leninist government and now has a free market Western capitalist government is way poorer than they were before. And all the polls in those country after country after country, they do polls, and people say life was better before the fall of communism in every single one of those countries. So we know what would have happened if the Dubček people had won. They would have they won eventually, and it brought disaster. So Ted Dostal was right. The Soviet Union was right. They were able to prevent what happened eventually in 1989 from happening in 1968, right? Nobody can say that the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, benefited the people of Eastern Europe. It made their lives worse by every objective measure. They lived shorter. There was a higher suicide rate. There was a higher drug rate. There was a higher crime rate. There was higher poverty. There was higher malnutrition. I mean, it got really bad. In Ukraine, some cities only had electricity for like 3 or 4 hours a day. That's how bad the fall of the Soviet Union was. That's what those Prague Spring kids were marching for. And they probably didn't know that. They probably thought, oh, we want communism. We believe in socialism. We just want it to be democratic. We want to be able to watch American movies. We want to be able to, eat at McDonald's and stuff. That's what they were led to believe, but it was a lie. It was a trick. They were being duped. They were being duped by the American imperialists. And when they ultimately triumphed in 1989, what those countries got was mass hunger and poverty. So that's my thoughts on that. Hope that those were helpful insights. Updates on Alex Saab. Well, the latest article I see comes from Counterpunch. Without medicine, Diplomat Alex Saab could die in a U.S. jail. And they're talking about the conditions that Alex Saab is in as he's being detained in the United States. And it sounds very dire. Alex Saab, there is no legal basis for holding him in the United States. He was a diplomat. He was doing diplomatic work, and the USA grabbed him off a plane. Alex Saab needs to be freed immediately. Alex Saab, should be returned to his family. He has the right to be a diplomat for Venezuela. He had diplomatic immunity, so they could not have grabbed him off the plane. Everything about the detention of Alex Saab is completely illegal. So free Alex Saab, and that's the latest article I see about him. It was published just yesterday on Counterpunch about how he is facing some pretty bad conditions in jail. He needs medicine. What are your thoughts on the collapse of Peronism in Argentina and the emergence of fanatical neoliberal economist Javier Milei? I don't like that Javier Milei guy, right? I mean, he's awful. I mean, he's a nut. I mean, he's just a lunatic with the conspiracy theories and the, crazy libertarian economics. The main thing is that they've used the anti-corruption argument. That's the lawfare, anti-corruption lawfare. That's the argument that they've used, right? This is what they try to do. They say now they've realized that if you just attack these people for being communists, if you just attack them as dictators, or you attack them as being friends of Russia and China, people don't buy it. So what you do is you attack these countries. You attack these leaders as corrupt, and you point out that, God forbid, the president of a country has a relative who lives in New York City and lives in Manhattan. Why wouldn't he? Right? Or you point out, God forbid, they've got a really nice boat. They have a fancy boat. Well, he's the president of a country, and they do this, right? And then they play this game where it's like, oh, you're a hypocrite. You're a socialist and you have a nice boat to go out on a yacht with. Oh, my God. Right? And that's why, let's point this out. That's why it's really, really important that we make clear that socialism is not about redistribution of wealth. We got to lose the phrase redistribution of wealth. Every government in the world redistributes wealth. Governments tax people. They use the money for wars. They use the money to pave roads. They use the money to have social programs. Every system in the world has redistribution of wealth. Socialism is not a doctrine of envy. It's not a doctrine that says some people have more than others and that's no fair. That is not what we're saying. We are saying that the chaos of the market and profit organizing production is wrong, and that we need an economy organized to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few, so the wealth of all can increase. And if you think socialism is a doctrine of envy, all you have to do to discredit it is say, oh, in Cuba, the party leaders all drive fancy cars. Well, do you think the president of the United States doesn't drive a fancy car? Do you think Air Force One isn't a fancy plane? Of course it is. But in America, no one cares because we're capitalist, right? We expect the people that are in charge to have money. But if our ideology as socialists is a doctrine of envy, right? If it's the idea that some people have more than others and that's unfair, if you just point out that the communist leaders have more than others, which they do because they're the president of the country, right? Right? If you just point that out, then it's like people are like, oh my God, what hypocrites. They say they're against rich and poor and inequality, but they live a luxurious life. And I'm sure that Christina Kirchner lives a much better life than most people in Argentina do. Why? Because she's been the president of the country. Name one country in the world where the president lives in poor conditions, is poorer than the average citizen. It doesn't happen. Socialist, capitalist, or anywhere. You're the president of the country. You're taken care of pretty well. And you want that because then you can't be bought, right? The idea is that, if the president is struggling to pay his bills, he might have to please somebody and they bribe him, right? The idea is you want them to be comfortable enough that they're not bribable. Now, obviously, that's quite difficult, but, that's the idea. So, we shouldn't be shocked that the leaders of socialist countries live comfortable lives. They do. Right. And that's not an argument against socialism, unless you think socialism is the redistribution of wealth. If you think socialism is redistribution of wealth or making everyone equal, then you're going to be mad that Christina Kirchner has a nice mansion that she lives in. And And that's what the Panama Papers and this lawfare anti-corruption stuff, that's what it's largely about. And it's also about, the U.S. imperialists, they find a leader in an anti-imperialist country, and they figure out how to isolate them from other people within the anti-imperialist movement. Ahmadinejad in Iran, the U.S. imperialists, Ahmadinejad, he was the president of Iran. He's an Islamic anti-imperialist president. I don't know what you want me to say about him. But he was an anti-imperialist. He moved Iran in a more anti-imperialist direction. Friend of Fidel Castro, condemned capitalism in a lot of speeches. They've done this to Ahmadinejad. The Panama Papers and the anti-corruption thing, they played up the idea that Ahmadinejad is corrupt. Well, part of that, it's not just they want to demonize Iran. It's that there are differences in Iran among even the hardliner camp, right? You'll notice Ahmadinejad has no beard, right? He has no beard. And he was not a cleric. He was not a Muslim cleric. He was the first president they'd had in a long time who was not a Muslim cleric. Well, the current president, who I interviewed, the current president of Iran, Ibrahim Riazi, he's a cleric, a longtime cleric, and a judge in Iran. He's got a big beard, and he's a Muslim cleric. Well, there are differences in the hardliner camp, right? Ahmadinejad was more of a secular leader. Riazi, who's also a hardliner, he's more of a religious leader. There's differences, and that playing up the idea that Ahmadinejad was corrupt was a way of further pushing him out of politics. He lost the election. He was out, and then the Panama Papers came out, and they tried to play up this idea that he was corrupt, right? And that this is what they do, and that the way that they have demonized the Peronists in Argentina is by playing up this idea that they live in luxury, so therefore they're corrupt. And it's like, it's really unfortunate. I like the Kirchners. Christina Kirchner is an anti-imperialist in a lot of ways. And look, the economic results of neoliberalism in Argentina have been negative. Every time neoliberal economics gets in power in Argentina, it gets worse. Right. So, this guy Milner, he's got a good social media brand. He's good at making videos, and he's good at, he's like Bolsonaro. It's almost like a version of what like Andrew Tate and the Manosphere does over here. Right. Like Bolsonaro, like Trump. It's like, whoa, I like that guy. He tells it like it is. He insults people and all of that. And it's the new right. It's kind of a brand of the new right for Argentina. It's unfortunate. And my hope is that the left can get their shit together. But the left in Latin America is having a little bit of a problem because the imperialists have flanked them. And this is, the conditions in Latin America have changed, right? So the left in Latin America started winning. And so the United States changed its strategy in Latin America, and it started backing the synthetic left of Latin America, which is a total game changer for the United States. It used to be the United States backed the hard militarist right of Latin America. Well, now the United States flipped, and now the United States is backing the synthetic left, right? People like Petro in Colombia, et cetera. So the left in Latin America is having a little bit of an identity crisis, because their strategy has generally been to build a coalition to isolate the hard right. And now you have a fake left. For the first time in Latin America, you have a synthetic left, right? And that's creating a weird space. So Latin America, there's a need for there to be some maneuvering. But yeah, it's been very effective. The United States, by funding the synthetic left in Latin America, the NGOs, the environmental thing, the drug movement in Latin America, the USA has amped up its support and built a synthetic left in Latin America, and that has confused the shit out of the genuine communist left in Latin America. And so there's a need for things to change. There you go. Semantic point, but isn't ML not a dogma? It's supposed to be scientifically shaped by the conditions you are in. Pure ML may never, of course, right. But there are certain ways you do things that come out of ML, like, you have a democratic centralist organization of a party. There were the 21 points that Lenin had for joining the Communist International. Right? Those are considered to be they call them the 21 points, right? The 21 points of Lenin, the 21 conditions. You can read the Wikipedia page, and that's pretty much in order to be ML, in order to be fully in line with Marxism-Leninism, you generally have to practice the 21 conditions for entry into the Communist International. The 21 conditions. That's what it means to be ML. You know, point number 1, all propaganda and agitation must bear a really communist character. Point number 2, every organization that wishes to join the Communist International must remove all reformists and centrists. 3, in every country in Europe and America, the class struggle is entering the phase of civil war. You know, they must place no trust in legality. 4, the duty of propagating communist ideas. 5, systemic and methodological agitation in the countryside. 6, every party must unmask social patriotism and social pacifism. 7, the parties wish to belong to the Communist International must completely break with reformist politics, particularly marked and clear attitude for the colonies. You must support the colonies and oppressed nations. Every party must persistently develop activities within the trade unions. Every communist party must be opposed to the reformist Second International. Every communist party must have parliamentary factions. They must practice democratic centralism. Number 13, the communist parties must undertake purges from time to time. They must give unconditional support to the Soviet Union. The parties, they must have a new communist program and reject their social democratic one. The communist parties, must follow the direction of the Communist International. The communist parties must use the name communist and not call themselves social democrats or socialists. The communist parties must print official documents and deliver them to the Communist International. All the parties must have a special Congress to join the Communist International. All the parties must radically alter their tactics to be in line with the Communist International's tactics. All the parties, they must expel all the people who don't agree to this. It's the 21 conditions, right? You know, that in order to be part of the Communist International, you had to agree with 21 points, so I guess that's really what it means to be pure ML, with those 21 points of membership in the Comintern. So there we go. All right, everybody. Well, it's been fun. We've gone for about 2 hours. I think I'm probably going to take tomorrow off. I generally don't stream on Sundays, but I'll be back on Monday. It's been fun, everybody. Thanks for asking good questions. Thanks for getting me talking. I have a lot of books to put back on my bookshelf, but that's good. It was a good discussion tonight. One last reminder that we are having an amazing, amazing conference in Portland. An amazing conference in Portland coming up. It's going to be utterly, utterly amazing. So we need you there. We need you there. Register for the conference. Donate to help us do the conference. This is my focus right now, is that conference. This is going to be a very, very important event to end the year of 2023. So thanks, everybody. All right, I am gonna put on the closing music. In the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.